We live in a world where I am terrified of the new generation of children. It keeps me up at night knowing they may not have the same opportunities that we were afforded. By now, you know I'm talking about the lack of Saturday morning cartoons. Seriously, where have they gone? There's nothing better than getting up on a Saturday morning and beating your parents down to the television with a great big bowl of cereal where the only two ingredients are sugar and food coloring. Every child waited for the famous start of the Looney Tunes. The Looney Tunes were the best of all Saturday cartoons, and it has a lot to offer us. Some of the great mysteries have yet to be solved, and we need this next generation of children to solve them. Like, will Elmer Fudd ever catch that wascally wabbit? Will Pepe Le Pew ever find true love? Will Wile E. Coyote ever catch the Roadrunner? And finally, will Bugs Bunny ever make the right turn at Albuquerque? These are the great questions of the day that need to be answered. But the funniest, and perhaps the most prophetic, of all the Looney Tunes is the overconfident and stubborn Foghorn Leghorn. Foghorn Leghorn was one of the greatest, with his deep Virginia accent, I say, oh boy, and his constant need to keep the farm under control. He was the great overseer to make sure the farm was going the way it was supposed to. He made it a point to make protégés such as the genius Egghead Jr. Foghorn always made it his personal mission to train him up in the same way that he was trained, to grow up and be a good rooster. There's a particular episode where Foghorn wanted to teach Egghead how to scout and the ways of living outdoors. His fear that Egghead read too many books and would never be well adjusted in life. They went out in the woods one day to learn how to trap, and Foghorn tried to teach him how to build a trap the right way. Well, maybe not the right way, but Foghorn's way. After Foghorn fumbled and bumbled and tried to make this trap, Egghead came along and did something a lot better. And Foghorn was mad. Not that he built a trap, but that he did it better than Foghorn. Even though Egghead went above and beyond, he still listened to Foghorn, even though it was better, even though Foghorn's trap was a little more archaic. Egghead still followed Foghorn around. He listened. He always obeyed. And Foghorn still continued to lead this boy out of love and a need to disciple the next generation of roosters, despite all the comical situations he found himself in. So in a similar way, Foghorn is like Paul. Paul overseeing the churches that he's planted, and this is after he had witnessed the Corinthian church almost implode on itself. But he keeps pressing on, leading the congregations. Paul writes this letter to the Philippians, partially from a jail cell. And he loves this church dearly and wants to see it grow and mature as he knows it can be a true gift. Paul never asked or of anything of this church, but we learn in chapter 4 that the Philippians did give him money. But he does ask something of the Philippian church. He asked for them to be imitators of himself and imitators of Christ so they know the right way to go. He instructs them to be aware of earthly things that trip them up. And he asks them to keep their eyes on the prize. Paul is calling his church to be Christian leaders. And I want you to know this morning that God is calling you to be a Christian leader. So what does that look like? A Christian leader doesn't have to be a pastor or a minister. Paul does not put stipulations for who can lead others. If we follow the verse structure, we know that Christian leaders are first Christian imitators. Who are we supposed to imitate? How are we supposed to imitate? If we look at the scripture and dig a little bit deeper, we come to a little bit of an issue. This verse can be rendered in quite a few ways. The first one being that we are called to be imitators of Paul, which is how most translations are rendered. But it can also be inferring, saying, imitate Christ who is in Paul. Many a tree have been chopped down to settle this argument, and many a PhD have been given out based off this verse. So which one is it? Are we supposed to imitate Paul or imitate Christ? And like a true dialectic, the answer is yes, both and. We are to imitate both Paul and Christ. We are to keep an eye on those who live like we do. We should imitate Paul in the way we pour ourselves out into our calling and always being obedient. Taking time to pray and to rest and being like Christ, we should be like in every facet of our lives. Pouring ourselves into disciples and pouring himself out for all of us. Learning how to drive was one of the best and worst experiences I've ever had. My very first car was a 2001 Dodge Durango, chili pepper red, beautiful. When you turned it over, it sounded like American ingenuity at its finest. If you look at my car now and you try to turn it over, it's like flicking the cage of a hamster wheel, trying to get it to run. But I digress. And so, being the oldest of 3 children, I was the guinea pig of my parents' pedagogical torture chamber, if you will. My dad's approach to learning how to drive was like throwing your child into the deep end of the pool. You just do it. So my dad took me out on the interstate and he said, just drive. And my dad would lean back, close his eyes, and take a nap as I drove down the interstate. So either my dad had nerves of steel or he was ready to meet Jesus right then and there. Now, my mother had a more hands-on approach. By hands-on, I meant one hand on the safety bar and another hand on my neck. She would say, oh, you got to do this. There's a stop sign coming. There's a stop sign coming. There's a red light. Car, here. It was stressful. But when it was my parents' turn to drive, they noticed that I was watching. And so you could see my parents pick up some better habits along the way. My parents started driving 10 and 2, adjusting mirrors and looking both ways. And they would look over to me and say, Tyler, do as I say and not as I do. And they would bolt out in the traffic, cutting off like 3 or 4 cars. This is imitation at its finest. Whether you like it or not, if you confess to be a Christian, people are watching you and what you do. People look at you through the lens of Christianity. Not only the lens of Christianity, their own lens of Christianity. And comparing you to what they think Christians should be. You are doing the same things as well. We all look at the great people of faith and try to be like them. We mimic their mannerisms and their ways to connect with God. We need to know that we are being watched, and we need someone to watch for our own selves. So how do we do this? Dr. Joel Weaver describes imitation like this. Visualize the person in one hand and hold the cross of Christ in the other hand. And how similar do they look? If they look similar, then they're people of imitation, people of value to imitate. If this person does not look like the cross of Christ, maybe they're not worth following. Now, obviously, we're not going to be a perfect match of the cross of Christ, and certainly we all fall short of that cross. But we're still supposed to try. We're still supposed to imitate. Even Christ said, pick up your cross and follow me. An act of imitation, an act of obedience. But if we know that we're striving for a deeper and closer relationship with God, then we can know that they are worthy of being a Christian leader for us. and we can know if we are worthy of being Christian leaders. Secondly, a Christian leader is not bulletproof, and that they're fully aware of that. Paul writes this section, even with tears. We can gather that Paul is still extremely hurt about the events that transpired in Corinth. Philippians was written shortly after the letters to the Corinthians. And it's sending a stark message to this church in Philippi to not be like Corinth. And the problem with Corinth wasn't that there was a church in Corinth, but that there was too much Corinth in the church. The leaders were succumbed to temptations of overindulgence and seeking earthly honor. If we look closely, these are the same issues found over and over again. They're superimposed on each other. The God of their stomachs can relate back to the Lord's Supper passage in 1 Corinthians. Honor and shame is what the Corinthians held dear. And Paul, again, is talking about their honor is in their shame. This is exactly what Paul doesn't want for the Philippians. He calls for their leaders to stand firm in what they've been taught and not become enemies of the cross, or even more egregious, deniers of the cross. Whether you are a Denver Broncos fan or not, you can't deny that Peyton Manning is one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game of football. Not only was he great on the field, he was great off the field. There was a practice squad receiver who was on the team but didn't really travel. And while Peyton Manning was hurt, he would train with this practice squad receiver. This receiver would probably even never see playtime. So he was always around Peyton as he was recovering. But the Broncos made it to the Super Bowl that year. And they needed to get on the plane with suits. Well, this practice squad receiver couldn't afford a suit. Believe it or not all football players make an egregious amount of money. So Peyton Manning, out of great gratitude, bought this kid, essentially, 4 or 5 custom-made suits so that he would have something to wear to the Super Bowl. And that's just one of the great examples of how good a person Peyton Manning is. But Peyton Manning was not perfect. In his time in college at the University of Tennessee, he got in an incident where he was charged with, or he was accused of sexual misconduct with a trainer. He did not rape her or assault her, but what he did was not pretty and not acceptable. You have to hold those two in tension. Peyton Manning is a great leader. Peyton Manning does great things. He donated a hospital. He was a great football player. But Peyton Manning was not bulletproof. Peyton Manning had a past. Peyton Manning was not Superman. In the same way, none of us are bulletproof. None of us have a perfect history, but we are still called to be leaders. While it's easy to talk about grace and forgiveness now, let us stay in the realm of the uncomfortable for a moment. Paul is telling us to keep our eyes peeled so we do not fall into temptation. These temptations that Paul lists are not some things anyone who is mentally disturbed would think about doing. These are temptations that haunt Christians daily. The temptation to hoard onto what is ours, the temptation to always be right and to seem more perfect than the ones who are around us. These are temptations we face every time we wake up. These are temptations that haunt me to my core, as do all temptations. Christian leaders are not bulletproof. It is the Christians who think they have it all together are the ones who end up succumbing to temptation over and over again, like quicksand. That is our sinful nature. It wasn't the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. It was the pride of the crew who thought they didn't need to steer around it. Finally, Christian leaders always have their eye on the prize, which is our citizenship in heaven. Citizenship in the first century, at least in Rome, was something that was coveted to no end. Being a citizen of Rome meant you were eligible for aid, similar to Social Security and welfare. You even had a chance for a semi-reliable trial if you called on the name of Caesar. Paul even had Roman citizenship, as well as Jewish citizenship. But Paul is calling us to strive for something higher, something holier than earthly citizenship. We are reminded that those who are found in Christ have an eternal citizenship that is infinitely better than any earthly citizenship we can find, that will eventually disappear in the annals of history. There are actual benefits to being a Christian leader. That is, to be a witness to the day when Christ returns and brings everything under his control. Then again, we are transformed and glorified. But that is only if we keep our eyes on the prize. Me and my girlfriend are training for a 5K right now, and I don't know why anybody would pay money to run. But that is what we are doing. We wake up early in the morning and we run the bear trail. Now, my girlfriend is an experienced runner. She's done marathons, half marathons, 10Ks, 5Ks, 15Ks, any K you think of. I, on the other hand, would rather drive 3 miles and not pay $35 than to run for a t-shirt. But that is just me. When we train, my girlfriend is very calm and collected. She knows all the right things. And I look like a flailing heap of garbage. There's a technique to running. It's all in the eyes, actually. If you look down as you run, you don't see anything ahead of you. And it just looks like an endless strip of road. And if you look up, it's hard to run a straight line. And so you end up flailing around that way. So the key to when you're running, apparently, other than being in shape, is having your eyes on the horizon, where the sky meets earth. You keep a straight line, you keep focused, you keep encouraged. There's always a goal ahead. In the same way, if we're called to lead, we don't put our head down. We're just going to make things harder. But don't keep your head in the clouds either. You will not be an effective leader that way. Instead, keep your eyes on the horizon. Keep your eyes on the prize, which is our glorious citizenship in heaven that cannot fade and will never be taken away. Stay the course. Imitate those who have gone before you. Always know that someone is watching you. Know that you are human, and even though you are a confessing Christian, we are still subjects to great temptation. And keep your eyes on the prize. While life may not seem fair and welcoming down here, keep your eyes on the horizon. That is our reconciliation with our Creator and an eternity with the Father. Amen.